You're so dramatic.
No, please.
The Grand Seoul Hotel's main ballroom oozed sophistication. Golden lights fell on impeccable arrangements, and the raised glasses reflected not only the crystal, but also the masks of an elite who applauded more out of convenience than admiration. At the center of attention, Yoon Dae-sung, the charismatic CEO of the Yoon Group empire, spoke firmly about honor, family, and loyalty. While beside him, his wife, Yoon Hae-won, maintained the same serene gaze that had always defined her. But there was something about this night that didn't quite fit. A silence behind the laughter, a tension behind the flashes. It was as if the truth was about to rip through the veneer of the spectacle. And then, as if the universe itself decided to reveal what was hidden, the sharp sound of glass shattering in his hand brought the room to a halt. Without hesitation, Dae-sung turned to Hae-won. His once proud gaze was now that of a man consumed by fury. In front of everyone, businessmen, journalists, friends, he accused her, humiliated her, pushed her. Hae-won's white dress, stained with red wine, became a symbol of a devastating public downfall. As the silence was filled with murmurs and cameras, Dae-sung left the place hand in hand with his lover, as if he had conquered something. But what he didn't know was that at that moment, he wasn't closing a chapter. He was signing the first act of his own downfall. After all, what happens when the man who destroys a woman in public is forced to face her? Reborn in front of everyone? Don't miss any detail of this intense story. Subscribe now and turn on notifications to find out what happens next. And don't forget to like if you want to see the truth finally revealed. The rain that night persisted for days, washing the streets of Seoul as if the sky itself wanted to erase the scandal that now dominated the headlines. Magazines displayed in glittering letters the name of Korea's most admired man, the CEO Yoon Dae-sung, and the woman who in the public eye had destroyed the perfect home. The Empire Yoon Group, a symbol of luxury and power, continued to function like a well-oiled machine, but within its corridors the air had become dense, permeated with murmurs and averted glances. Dae-sung, now beside Kang So-ra, he tried to maintain the firm expression of someone who had everything under control, even when loneliness began to infiltrate his gestures, discreetly, like a shadow that followed him without asking permission. The apartment, where Hae-won used to live, seemed frozen in time. The teacup still sat on the table, and an unfinished canvas rested on the easel in front of the window. She had painted the sky in soft shades of blue, as if to capture the peace she dreamed of one day finding again. Every detail of the place was a silent portrait of a woman who loved beyond reason, who believed that the heart could mend what pride insisted on breaking. Her absence had transformed the space into a shrine of memories. Meanwhile, Dae-sung sank deeper and deeper into the routine that defined him. Endless meetings, strategic dinners, and calculated smiles kept the empire built on discipline and coldness afloat. His employees feared him, and investors revered him as an infallible man. But when the office doors closed and silence fell, his gaze changed. For brief seconds, the expression of victory gave way to something more human, a restlessness he refused to name. Hae-won, meanwhile, continued to try to comprehend what remained of herself after being publicly shattered. The sweet woman who once woke up early to make coffee and waited for her husband with the weary smile of someone who still believed in love had become a shadow. She watched the news and saw his name plastered across events alongside his lover, with the same calm as someone observing a stranger. And yet, something inside her refused to hate him completely. Between the glitter of the glass towers and the cold of the wet streets, two worlds now moved in opposite directions. One represented the power sustained by lies, the other the pain that silently planted the seeds of transformation. And as Dae-sung climbed another rung on the ladder of success, a question began to form in the mind he tried to keep impenetrable. What if everything he believed he was winning was, in fact, just the beginning of his own downfall? The real poison began to be distilled weeks before that fateful night, when Kang So-ra, driven by an ambition disguised as tenderness, noticed the hidden fragility behind the impeccable posture of Yoon Dae-sung. She knew his every weakness, the need for approval, the fear of betrayal, the pride of a man who confused love with possession. It was with an almost surgical delicacy that she began to plant doubts in his mind. Small, whispered phrases over discreet dinners, strategically sad glances, and messages that hinted at distorted truths. "You know, she doesn't understand you anymore," So-ra murmured as she slid her hand over her wineglass, letting silence fill the space between them. Her words quickly took root, like weeds growing between the cracks of a hardened heart. Dae-sung began to watch his wife's every gesture with suspicion, reinterpreting old memories in a new light, tainted with suspicion. A simple phone call in the evening became a clue. A distant smile became evidence of betrayal. He began to avoid Haewon's gaze, convinced that her love had become a well-rehearsed lie. Meanwhile, his mother, Madam Yoon, a woman with an imposing presence and a cutting voice, fueled the flames of this paranoia. To her, Haewon had never been worthy of the family, an outsider with no surname, no fortune, no influence. "Son, some women only approach men like you out of interest," she repeated in a sweet but venomous tone. And Dae-sung, blinded by pride and filial loyalty, allowed himself to be entangled in this web of manipulation until he mistook arrogance for reason. Hae-won, on the other hand, felt the abyss growing without understanding its origin. Cold responses, prolonged silences, and empty stares began to replace affection. She tried to reach out to him, but her words seemed to bounce off an invisible wall. As his distrust grew, her love became a distant echo, powerless against the gathering storm. Then came the final blow. So-ra showed Dae-sung a series of forged messages, carefully manipulated photos, and a distorted video that hinted at an intimate encounter between Haewon and another man. His shock was immediate, but instead of seeking the truth, he chose to believe what fed his pride. He didn't want to be deceived. He wanted to punish before he doubted. And so, the man who so valued control allowed the most destructive emotion to govern his decisions. His wife's public humiliation was merely the inevitable result of a carefully cultivated lie. What Dae-sung didn't realize was that, in that very moment he believed he was clearing his honor, he was signing the beginning of a silent curse. Because there are mistakes that time forgives, but there are sins that destiny prefers to collect. And the price of Dae-sung's vanity would soon begin to be exacted, when the woman he destroyed was forced to face the world alone. The morning after the scandal, the streets of Seoul seemed to reflect the same grayness that spread through the heart of Yoon Hae-won. The news had already taken over the portals, magazines, and gossip shows. Images of the party, seconds-long videos captured. On cell phones, headlines in giant letters describing her as the tycoon's unfaithful wife. Within hours, the woman who had always lived in the shadows became the most talked-about topic in Korea. Every click was a new wound, every comment a silent blow. She began walking the streets with her face covered by a scarf, avoiding the gazes of onlookers and the cameras that followed her like predators. She tried to explain herself, sought out her husband, and left messages that would never be answered. Yoon Dae-sung, now surrounded by advisors and his lover, ignored any attempts to contact him. Behind the scenes at the company, it was said that he had freed himself of a burden, and society applauded his decision with the hypocrisy of those who don't know the truth. Penniless, friendless, and with her reputation destroyed, Hae-won sought refuge in a small, old apartment on the outskirts of Seoul. The moldy walls and oppressive silence became her constant companion. At night, the distant sounds of the city were the only reminder that life still existed beyond the pain. She began giving private art lessons to children, trying to support herself with what little dignity remained. But even surrounded by innocent smiles, the emptiness remained. With every brushstroke she taught, he was reminded of the colors he had lost within himself. About that, Dae-sung paraded in gala events with Kang So-ra beside him, the camera flashes freezing their plastic smiles. He believed he had cleared the family name. Yet at night, when silence invaded the hallways of his new apartment, the image of Hae-won lying on the floor returned like a persistent ghost. The sound of her dress ripping, her tearless gaze, the rain beating against the windows, it all came back with every sip of whiskey. One morning, Hae-won fell ill. She had a high fever, her body weakened, and no helping hand was available. The nearest public hospital welcomed her as one of hundreds. She didn't complain, just stared at the white ceiling and remembered how Dae-sung would hold her hand on cold nights, promising he'd never leave her alone. A bitter irony coursed through her soul. It was as if love had become a distant memory, almost unreal. When she was finally discharged, she decided she would no longer search for answers. She took a train to the countryside, with no specific destination, just an old suitcase and a silent gaze. She wanted to forget his name, the city, the life she once believed would last forever. In her heart, love and sorrow coexisted like embers that refused to be extinguished. But fate, ever mindful of the imbalance between pain and justice, watched her silently. And as Hae-won disappeared into the train lights, a strong wind blew over Seoul, carrying with it the first hint that nothing would remain hidden forever. Because when love is wounded to its limit, it doesn't die, it transforms. And sometimes what rises from the ashes is no longer love, but something much more powerful. The train cut through the dawn like a line of light crossing the void. Inside it, Yoon Hae-won watched the reflection of her own face in the window, distorted by movement. With each season, the past seemed to recede a little further, as if fate wanted to grant her the chance to disappear without a trace. When morning came, she no longer knew where she was, only that she had reached a point where no one knew her, and where her name, Yoon, had no more weight. The following days were marked by a silent struggle. He slept in cheap boarding houses, ate what he could, and between one temporary job and another, began to rediscover the taste of healing solitude. Sometimes he would sit by the river, watching the leaves fall and wondering if love, like trees in winter, would bloom again after the pain. Each sunset seemed to whisper that yes, life still had a purpose, even if she didn't yet know what it was. In Seoul, meanwhile, news began to spread as quickly as a rumor. A terrible accident had occurred on a highway near Daejeon. A bus overturned in heavy rain, and several victims were identified only by belongings found among the wreckage. Among them, an old suitcase and a painting bearing the signature of Yoon Hae-won. The press announced his death without question, and the story of Tycoon Yoon's missing wife once again dominated the news. Yoon Dae-sung, upon reading the news, felt the ground shake for a moment. There were no tears, just a dense silence that held his breath. He went to the symbolic funeral organized by social convention, accompanied by Kang So-ra, who displayed the same calculated look of someone who sees victory complete. Before the altar, Dae-sung remained motionless, observing her portrait surrounded by white flowers. The woman's gaze in the photo seemed alive, almost accusatory. For the first time, he couldn't maintain his own mask. As he tossed the flowers into the Han River, the wind blew strongly, lifting the guests black. scarves. The water slowly carried the petals away, while the distant sound of thunder echoed through the mountains. For a brief second, Dae-sung, he thought he heard her name carried on the wind. Hae-won. But when he turned around, all that was left was emptiness. Life went on, and the world believed the woman had died. But death is sometimes just fate's disguise to prepare a return. And somewhere far away, between the sound of rain and the smell of fresh paint, Hae-won breathed again, reborn not as a victim, but as the seed of something that would soon transform the entire empire that tried to destroy her. The months following the death of Yoon Dae-won seemed, to Yoon Dae-sung, a disguised calm. The press, for a brief period, silenced the scandals and returned to extolling him as the example of a man who had overcome pain and regained control. Alongside Kang So-ra, he posed for magazine covers, inaugurated million-dollar projects, and gave speeches about new beginnings and overcoming. But beneath the glare of the cameras, there was something no lens captured. A growing restlessness, a nagging feeling that success was beginning to lose its flavor. At night, the new apartment, luxurious, quiet, impeccably decorated, became a desert. The sound of So-ra's heels echoed through the hallways, accompanied by forced laughter and the constant clinking of wine glasses. She liked to talk about investments, fashion, and travel. He, however, had stopped listening. Little by little, the image of the woman who had fallen to the floor during the party returned vividly, like a barely healed wound, and the more he tried to forget her, the more vivid she became within him. The first sign of decline came from where it was least expected. A billion-dollar contract with a foreign company was cancelled without explanation. Shortly thereafter, one of the most senior directors resigned, taking confidential information with him. Within weeks, shares plummeted, partnerships were severed, and rumors of corruption began to circulate. Dae-sung tried to fight back, but the empire he had spent a lifetime building now seemed to be crumbling before everyone's eyes. The press, which had previously extolled him, now devoured him. Headlines called him an unstable CEO, a leader in emotional collapse, a man who lost everything because of his own pride. Each word was like a stone thrown against an already cracked castle. So-ra, feeling the ship sinking, slowly withdrew, reconnecting with old contacts and seeking a new opportunity among his rivals. Amidst the chaos, Dae-sung began wandering the Seoul nights like a man adrift. He entered anonymous bars, drank until he lost track of time, and watched the city reflected in the rain puddles, as if hoping to find, in some distorted reflection, the face that so tormented him. One night, as he left one of these places, he spotted a woman with a red umbrella crossing the street. The way she walked, her posture, the delicacy of her gestures made his heart race. He ran after her, calling a name that the wind swallowed. When he finally reached the sidewalk, she had disappeared. From that moment on, something in him began to snap. The rational, methodical man, master of every detail, began to doubt his own sanity. The nightmares became frequent. In each one, he relived the scene from the party, but this time, when he pushed her, he saw his own reflection fall with it. The Empire Yoon Group began to slowly crumble, not by external forces, but by an invisible punishment, the kind of punishment that arises within those who lose the balance between power and conscience. And as reporters chased him through the streets with microphones and questions, Dae-sung began to feel a presence around him, as if something was watching him from a distance, silent, patient. It was the prelude to the return. Because destiny, unlike men, never forgets, and the name he believed buried would soon echo again from a place no amount of money could silence. Time, which had always seemed to be an ally of Yoon Dae-sung, now became his silent executioner. The days passed slowly, dragging on between crises and silences. The company that had once been a symbol of strength now survived on loans and empty promises. The few who still surrounded him did so out of convenience or pity. Dae-sung had taken to living in isolation in a glass apartment overlooking the Han River, the same one where, years before, he had laid the flowers at his funeral. Yoon Dae-sung. Sometimes he would spend hours staring at the city's reflection in the murky waters, wondering when it had all started to fall apart. It was during one of those sleepless nights that chance, or perhaps fate, decided to reveal its first clue. The sound of the television, left on only to fill the void, began to catch his attention. A female voice echoed softly but firmly, speaking of forgiveness, overcoming, and faith in a new beginning. Dae-sung glanced up, distracted. But what he saw next made his blood run cold. On the screen, a woman smiled before the cameras, dressed with serene elegance, surrounded by reporters. The caption read, "Founder of the Light of Tomorrow Foundation, Yoon Dae-sung." For an instant, time stood still. He leaned closer to the screen, unable to blink. Her eyes, alive, sure, intense, pierced the glass as if looking directly at him. The same woman he had seen lying on the ground now spoke before the entire country, transformed, stronger than she had ever been. Her voice held a peaceful tone that contrasted sharply with the chaos consuming him. "Pain is the beginning of transformation and forgiveness, the path to freedom," she said. Dae-sung slumped into the armchair, the remote slipping from his trembling hand. Memories came flooding back, the shove, the white dress, the sound of cameras, the wounded look. But now that look had changed, no more pain, just a serenity that disarmed him. He tried to laugh it off, believing it was a mistake, a doppelganger, a coincidence. But the more he watched, the more evident the truth became. She was alive. For days, Dae-sung immersed himself in her news reports, interviews, and public appearances. He discovered that Dae-sung had founded an organization supporting women who had suffered abuse and public humiliation, the same kind of suffering he himself had inflicted on her. She had rebuilt her life, not out of revenge, but out of compassion. And the more he read, the more he realized that nothing in her success had anything to do with power. It was the purity of natural justice at work, giving him back everything he had unwittingly lost. With each new image, the pride that once sustained his name crumbled. The woman he had thought destroyed had become the cruelest mirror of his own ruin. Dae-sung shone with a light he had never known how to cultivate. And now his existence was living proof that love, when reborn, no longer needs the one who hurt it to exist. But fate, generous and merciless, is not content merely to reveal itself. It demands confrontation, the moment when past and present collide before eyes that can no longer feign blindness. And Dae-sung didn't know it yet. But the reunion that fate had in store wouldn't just be a shock. It would be the final sentence of a heart that believed it could bury its own regret. For days, Yoon Dae-sung, he tried to convince himself that he didn't need to see her. It was enough to know that she was alive, that she had moved, on that fate had saved her for another purpose. But regret has a corrosive power. The more one tries to ignore it, the deeper it penetrates the soul. The images of Yoon Dae-sung on the screens, the serene smiles, the firm voice, everything seemed to be calling him to an agreement he'd been putting off since the night he pushed her to the ground. And when he learned she was participating in a charity event in Busan, the same place where she was born, impulse overcame reason. The journey there was long and silent. The train cut through the country amidst the fog, and each kilometer seemed to take him deeper into his own consciousness. Dae-sung stared out the window, seeing his aged reflection in the glass, and wondered what kind of man he had truly been. He remembered their first meeting, Haewon's shy smile when she saw him enter the art gallery, still young, enchanted by the colors and the calm it conveyed. How could that simple, pure love turn into an irreparable mistake? Yusuga auditorium where the event was taking place was full. The soft lights, calm music, and the sound of echoing voices created an almost sacred atmosphere. When she entered, time seemed to slow down. Dressed in white and grey, Haewon, he brought with him a presence that blended sweetness and firmness. As he took the stage, he spoke with a clarity that seemed to pierce hearts. There are pains that destroy us, and others that shape us. Sometimes you have to lose everything to finally understand who you are. He watched her from the back of the audience, motionless, his chest heaving with a mixture of guilt and admiration. When the ceremony ended, he approached slowly, fearful of being seen, but unable to leave. Haewon turned, as if she already knew he was there. Her gaze held neither anger nor contempt, only distance. Haewon. His voice sounded shaky, filled with something that hadn't been present in his tone for a long time. Fragility. Time changes everything, Dae-sung. Even pain, she replied without raising her voice, as if closing a cycle. For a few seconds, they just stared at each other. And in that brief interval, years of guilt, regret, and silenced love were compressed into a single instant. He wanted to justify himself, to explain the inexplicable, but she calmly raised her hand, stopping him. "There's nothing that needs to be said," he murmured. "Fate has already spoken for us." She walked away with the same serenity of someone who forgives, without needing to say the word forgiveness. Dae-sung stood there motionless, watching her disappear among the people, while a strange feeling invaded him, that perhaps the true punishment wasn't losing her, but having her back only to realize how small he'd become in the face of her greatness. But destiny had not yet finished its work, because there are pains that are resolved in silence, and there are others that the universe insists on making visible to all. And when his name returned to the headlines, it would no longer be as a symbol of success, but as the embodiment of the price that pride exacts. The days following the reunion were like a broken mirror, reflecting fragments of everything that Yoon Dae-sung tried to hide from himself. The serene image of Yoon Haewon haunted him, not as a memory, but as a constant presence, a living reminder that her forgiveness was more painful than any punishment he could imagine. And it was precisely in this state of disorientation that fate's final blow began to unfold, silent, merciless, like an old debt being collected with interest. An anonymous tip fell into the hands of the press, revealing documents that linked the Yoon Group to a series of fraudulent contracts. The same magazines that once featured the tycoon's smiling face now chronicled his downfall. Headlines in red, "Yoon's empire crumbles." The cameras that once captured the glamour of his parties now recorded the desperation of a man cornered by accusations, internal betrayals, and the complete loss of public trust. Kang So-ra, fearing she would be dragged along, disappeared from the country without warning. Dae-sung's allies abandoned him one by one, and his partners demanded his immediate resignation. Overnight, he went from being a symbol of prestige to becoming the man everyone avoided mentioning. As he left the building that bore his name for the last time, the Seoul wind blew coldly on his face, the same wind that years before had lifted Haewon's veil on the Han River. He walked aimlessly through the streets, mingling with the crowd that watched him without recognizing him. The man who ruled with his gaze could now barely lift his head. The shop windows reflected his distorted, weary image, and each step seemed to weigh twice as much. The distant sound of sirens, the echo of reporters shouting questions, and the incessant flashing of cameras formed a cruel symphony. Amidst the chaos, a small detail caught her eye. A television screen displayed in a store broadcasting a live interview. It was her, Hae-won, talking about the Foundation's work. The contrast between their two worlds was unbearable. While he sank into disgrace, she illuminated the country with her example. And for the first time, Dae-sung understood what the true punishment meant. Not losing the empire, but watching the woman he destroyed become everything he had pretended to be. With tears in his eyes, he walked away from the crowd and sat on a bench in the light rain. Each drop that fell on his skin seemed to repeat the same whisper, "Now it's your turn to fall." But fate still had one more move in store, one final decision that would make him face not only the past, but his own soul. Because sometimes punishment doesn't end with the fall. It continues when fate decides to show that, even among the ashes, there may still be one last chance for redemption. The scandal completely destroyed the empire that Yoon Dae-sung he had built, and with him, the man he believed to be invincible. Now, no one called him president, no one bowed in his presence. All that remained was silence and solitude, faithful companions of those brought down by their own pride. One rainy night, staggering through alleys and shadows, Dae-sung collapsed. His weak body and exhausted mind gave way under the weight of years of remorse and despair. When he regained consciousness, the white ceiling of a social shelter was all he could see. The sounds around him were soft, slow footsteps, low voices, the smell of freshly served soup. A nurse explained that he had been found unconscious on the street and taken in by volunteers from a charity. The name of the charity immediately sent a chill down her spine. Light of Tomorrow Foundation. He tried to sit up, but his body trembled. On the wall, hanging, was a simple painting with the unmistakable signature, Yoon Dae-won. For days he remained there, almost silent, discreetly helping with small tasks, like washing dishes or sweeping the yard. No one seemed to recognize him, and he didn't introduce himself. It was as if he had ceased to exist. However, one day, as he handed trays to the volunteers, a familiar scent filled the air. When he looked up, time seemed to stand still. There she was, standing, watching him from a distance. There was no surprise on her face, only a serenity that ached. She walked toward him slowly without saying a word. She helped him set the tray, looked him in the eye, and silently waved to a waitress who approached and said, "Take care of him. This man needs rest." That was all. No speech, no mention of the past, just the gesture of someone who understood that forgiveness, when genuine, doesn't need to be announced. That night, Dae-sung sat alone, staring out the rain-fogged window. On the tray he'd received at dinner, he found a small, carefully folded paper flower, the same one she'd used to make in her youth. When he opened it, there was only one sentence. "May the light find those who are lost." He smiled for the first time in years, feeling that perhaps forgiveness was the only wealth he had left. But fate still held one last moment in store, the moment when both would no longer be seen as victim and culprit, but as living witnesses to that which time had never been able to destroy. Winter had come to Seoul, and with it, the biting air that seemed to pierce through to the soul. In the small shelter room, Yoon Dae-sung, he spent his days sitting by the window, watching the sky. Covered in heavy clouds, he no longer wore suits, no longer signed contracts, no longer carried the weight of a name that had once been feared. He had become just an ordinary man, someone who, after losing everything, finally understood the value of what could never be bought. On the cafeteria television, a special broadcast caught the volunteers' attention, National Humanitarian Merit Award. And when the name of Yoon Dae-won was announced, the entire room erupted in applause. Dae-sung looked up, and there she was, in a brightly lit room, accepting the trophy with a calm, genuine smile. She was wearing white again, but this time not as a symbol of fragility, but of rebirth. The reporter asked what that moment meant. And the answer came with the serenity of someone who'd been through hell and back. It means that love doesn't disappear, it just changes form. The words echoed within him like a mirror shattering the silence. In that instant, Dae-sung realized that her forgiveness wasn't just a gesture of kindness. It was a liberation. She had chosen to move on while he was still bound by the invisible chains of the past. And for the first time, he understood that the true punishment wasn't being hated, but being forgotten by those who had once truly loved him. At the end of the ceremony, the camera captured Hae-won gazing at the horizon, the same horizon he saw from the window. It was as if, on some invisible plane, the two connected one last time, without rancor, without pain, only with the silent acceptance that love, when purified by pain, becomes eternal. Dae-sung closed his eyes and let out a faint smile, the kind that precedes the end of a storm. Outside, the snow was beginning to fall, covering the ground with a peace he had never known. But before the silence could completely envelop him, a distant, almost imperceptible sound broke the air, as if fate still had something to whisper before the final act. The next morning dawned shrouded in a soft mist, the kind that transforms the city into a landscape suspended between dreams and memories, where every building, every street, and every detail seemed to carry the weight of recent events, as if Seoul itself breathed the silence that hung in the air. The shelter was immersed in an almost supernatural stillness, interrupted only by the distant sound of rain, which now fell intermittently, and the soft creak of doors being opened by staff members who cautiously avoided any noise that might disturb the moment. The city still seemed to be enveloped in the afterglow of what had happened the night before, and the first timid rays of sunlight barely managed to penetrate the veil of mist that made each shadow denser, more introspective, as if the entire world were waiting for something to finally reveal itself. In the back room, where light filtered through the partially drawn curtains, Yoon Dae-sung remained motionless, sitting in the same chair he always had, the one that had accompanied all his moments of important decisions, achievements, and silent defeats. He watched the horizon through the half-open window, staring at the thin line between the grey sky and the city stretching out before him, with wet streets and golden reflections from the still-lit streetlights. The carefully folded sheet on the bed betrayed the tranquility of a newly conquered moment, the calm that, paradoxically, came after a storm of emotions, humiliations, and learning. On the small table beside him lay the paper flower left by Hae-won, delicately folded, as if it carried not only the memory of simple gestures, but an entire universe of forgiveness, patience, and silent love. Beside the flower, a phrase was written in firm, precise lines, revealing the depth of a feeling that didn't need big words to be felt. Sometimes forgiveness is the quietest form of love. There was no pain on his face, no regret weighed down with undue weight, but a profound serenity of someone who had finally understood that life is not measured solely by power or status, and that time, though relentless, always offers the opportunity for redemption. The wind that blew through the window gently stirred the paper flower, and for a moment it seemed as if fate itself, with its implacable calm, bowed before the lesson learned, that the blind pride and arrogance that had once guided him were now powerless, and that every action had consequences that could not be ignored. The man who, in the not-so-distant past, had humiliated the woman who loved him with a cruel gesture, left behind not only the guilt, but also the pride that had blinded him, and departed from his own inner abyss with the lightness of someone learning to forgive himself before the world needs to forgive him. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Hae-won received the news that Dae-sung had finally found inner peace, that somehow regret had transformed into reflection, and that, in the absence of the violence of pride, only the humanity. that had previously been obscured remained. She fell silent, walked unhurriedly to the Han River, and watched for long minutes the reflection of the city on the calm water, now bathed in a shy ray of sunlight piercing the grey clouds. It was a delicate contrast between the storm that had passed and the serenity that now filled every curve of the landscape. She closed her eyes, felt the wind caress her face, and whispered his name, not with sadness, not with resentment or pain, but with silent gratitude, because the cycle had finally closed, and what remained was the memory of a love that, though marked by destruction, had taught lessons the whole world could understand about redemption, respect, and the power of true forgiveness. The camera slowly pulls back, capturing the river as it flows unhurriedly, the trees bending in the wind, and the paper flower, carried by the current, dancing with the water as if carrying with it all the weight of the past and the lightness of learning. In the background, the final soundtrack fills the air, blending soft notes with tones that evoke reflection and emotion, while the narration concludes the story, echoing like a reminder that goes beyond the simple plot of an episode. Fate does not forget. It only waits for the right moment to teach. Every gesture, every tear, every choice carries with it the power to transform what seemed irreversible. And it is in this moment, in this bridge between past and future, between pain and learning, that we realize that the story doesn't end, but lives on in the memory of those who experience it, those who observe it, and those who find in it a reflection of their own journey. Each character, each detail, each moment of silence or confrontation becomes a living memory, challenging us to examine our own actions and the impact they can have on others. Forgiveness, often silent and discreet, proves to be the key to breaking invisible chains, reconciling mistakes, and opening space for hope that seemed lost. If you believe that every tear shed, every injustice suffered, and every act of courage has its value, subscribe to the channel now and don't miss the next episode. Here, each story is more than just a story. It's a mirror of life, an invitation to reflection, and a reminder that no matter how heavy the past may be, there's always the chance to find redemption. And perhaps in the next story you watch, you'll see yourself reflected, recognize your own strength, or discover that hope, even in its most subtle forms, can transform everything around you. Don't forget to like the channel and continue receiving stories that touch, teach, and move you at every moment, because every click helps keep alive the power of storytelling that inspires, connects, and transforms lives.